If you believe everything you see on the internet, you would believe that Russia is winning the war of attrition in Ukraine. And while things certainly aren't great for either side in the war, it's actually Vladimir Putin who has more to worry about. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's break down the reality of the so-called Russian war of attrition. Okay, so the starting point for this conversation has to be casualty numbers. Now, a lot of commentators are going to sit there and tell you, oh, well, it's about tanks, it's about drones, it's about artillery. And if you're fighting a war, you absolutely want these things. But the reason is because in military doctrine, we refer to it as enablers, right? What does artillery do? It makes it so that when you have to conduct your ground assault, the target is less able to resist you and therefore inflict casualties. What is the point of a tank? It protects and provides covering fire for advancing troops. In this war, more than ever, you're seeing that the enablers on the battlefield reduce the casualties of the infantry troops who actually have to advance and do the dirty work of fighting. And so when we look at equipment, it's important, but the equipment losses are going to precede the actual losses to material. Because again, in this war we've seen, if Russia lost all of its tanks tomorrow, or Ukraine lost every single armored vehicle, they would still fight. Both sides would still be fighting. They would just be fighting and taking higher casualties. So we can use casualties as the best metric for the actual current state of affairs in the war of attrition. Now, that doesn't mean all casualties are created equal. And this is another problem that we run into. You can see that many of these estimates are killed and wounded, or some killed, some wounded, missing, captured. Different estimates are all over the place. Also, they take place in different time frames, right? So some might be the total for 2 years. Some might be the total of a rolling 12-month average. But even more complicated is wounded. And this is a problem if you've listened to any interview with any of the Ukrainian forces, particularly the Foreign Legion, who talk very openly about their operations and frankly talk openly in English. They discuss the fact that basically they say in our operations, the long-term value is that 100% of troops will be wounded. Now, this is their assault units who go into the trenches and dig things out, but 90% of wounds are what we won't call them superficial. That's sort of dismissive, but they are returned to duty shortly thereafter. And this aligns with my own experience, right? I had many soldiers who received Purple Hearts in my formation, but the majority of them had minimal time off following their wounds, right? They would, for example, say, hey, I got hit by an IED. I have a headache, or I got knocked out. And we'd say, hey, don't even worry about it. Go get an MRI, check on your brain, make sure you get you're clear. And then a few days later, they were returned to duty. So technically, something like, a quarter of my platoon was wounded in combat in my 12 months in Afghanistan. But in total, I would say we lost maybe 10 days of actual duty. Now, this is in Ukraine, likely a similar case. So when you see these huge wounded numbers, right, it's difficult to know. Are they some troops undoubtedly are so wounded that they are out of the fight permanently. Some are wounded that they are in recovery for months, and many may be wounded and they're returned to duty within the same month. So this is true of both Russia and Ukraine, and it makes things very difficult because there's an incentive by both sides to put out different numbers, right? Russia, for example, it's well known that their wounded troops receive additional benefits. And so these troops may be more likely to report wounds. In contrast, right, you may have Russian commanders who don't want to report wounded so that they can keep those soldiers as fit for duty and return to the fight. So you have to take these kind of stats with a huge grain of salt. And in fact, in this analysis, I'm going to argue that we should just throw them in the trash, right? Because the better metric is to simply compare KIA to KIA, because you just can't get around. It's like a murder case, right? did you commit tax fraud? Well, that's debatable. Did you commit, did you steal those groceries, or did you just forget to ring them up, right? But when you have a dead person, you can't work around it. There's no there's no gray area about murder, right? And so that's one of the reasons murder is used as a good proxy for all violent crimes, but in law enforcement reporting. And so we're going to use the number of KIA as a way to gauge where these forces are at in terms of the war of attrition and their ability to use the material to limit the amount of KIA. Now, having talked about all that, let's look at the attrition rate. Well, right now, the most current estimate that we had actually comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, who claims to have gotten a hold of confidential Ukrainian estimate, which puts the number killed at about 80,000. And then it says there's a preposterous 400,000 wounded, which again, likely true, but how many of those, but some of those troops could literally have been wounded 2 or even 3 times, sent to a medical facility, healed up, and returned to duty. So we're going to focus on the 80,000 that are confirmed KIA, right? The irony is, of course, the Russian Ministry of Defense likely has these same numbers that they say, oh, there's 500,000 killed and wounded Ukrainians. So again, like possibly true, but you have to, the term wounded is doing some work, right? So we're going to use 80,000 killed as a metric for the attrition rate Ukraine is experiencing. Now, when we look over at Russia, the most recent Western intelligence estimate, this is again cited for the same date, 17 September, is that about 200,000 are killed, and again, a preposterously high 400,000 wounded. So we'll use, I think these two metrics are the two best numbers we can use. Now, again, some of these, it's hard to gauge who's going to more likely treat their wounded, who's getting wounded less severely, tough to say. But we can use these two metrics as the easiest bet. So what we can see is that fundamentally, Ukraine is out killing Russia by about 2.5 to 1. So for every 1 Russian who's killed, about 2.5 Russians are killed, right? So what does that mean functionally? Well, it means there's another side of the equation. And I want to point this out. Here's the actual Wall Street Journal article that talks about these numbers. That, again, 80,000 to 200,000. Now, what the question then, when you have these kind of casualty numbers, is inputs, right? Because it's not about losses. It's about the ability to sustain them. Right? So if Russia can recruit 3 times as many troops as Ukraine and only lose 2.5 times as many troops as Ukraine, they are actually coming out on top. They're making a net gain to their military strength. Now, there's some problems with determining the number of troops being brought into the fight on both sides. It's very tough because Russia particularly doesn't centralize their system. In fact, they deliberately have a very convoluted system that includes volunteer formations. It includes individuals recruited from the independent DPR and LPR, i.e. the occupied regions of Ukraine. It includes officially not official PMCs. It includes, again, the formal military itself. It includes sometimes conscripts, sometimes not, sometimes mobilization troops, contract troops, prisoners who are mobilized. It includes foreigners who officially may not even be assigned to military units, who might technically be assigned to logistics companies. So it's hard to sort of tease these things out, but we can get an estimate for Russia. And the most popular estimate is the actual intelligence wing of the UK Ministry of Defense. And that is ballparking the Russian mobilization at around 1,000 people a month. That makes it, that lands at about 1,000 to 1,100 recruits a day. This is according to, so Ukraine's estimate and the UK Ministry of Defense estimate are about the same, right? And so that is really a useful way to gauge this kind of inputs, right? So you have, this is again from March 30th, 2024. So I say this is probably about correct, right? Now there's going to be some surges and drops, but this is likely about right. 30,000 soldiers a month is probably a good Russian average. So now you've got to ask yourself, what exactly can Russia sustain this and how, right? Well, the answer is, can they keep up with 30,000 people a month that they have to bring in? And the reality is that, well, maybe. There's a bunch of signs. There's some signs of trouble. But we're going to talk about those in a second. But first, we got to talk about Ukraine, right? Let's talk about the Ukrainian recruitment side. Now, Ukraine also has kind of a messy system. The reason is because they rely on volunteers, and those volunteers can enlist with individual units. So this is like if in the U.S. military, instead of saying, hey, I want to join the Army, you literally went to Fort Bragg and said, I want to join the 82nd Airborne. So it's a little more complicated. But Ukraine recently announced, and this was only just a few weeks ago, that each month about 6,500 volunteers are joining the Defense Force through recruitment centers. Now, this is distinct from the draft program, right? A lot of Ukrainians are still being drafted, but the smarter folks are saying, listen, I'm not going to wait for my draft notice because then I won't have a choice about where I'm assigned. They say, listen, particularly those who have specialty skills, oftentimes will go to these recruitment centers and say, hey, listen, I'm a car mechanic here, and I'll sign up. I'll join the armed forces in order to work on some of these tanks and vehicles to keep them running. And oftentimes this is a great strategy because if you say, listen, I want to serve, I know I'm going to get drafted, I will volunteer first and get to at least pick the job that I want to do instead of being sent to the area of best need, right? And they also say that, the defense forces in Ukraine have about 10,000 open positions, which is interesting, including for cooks, mechanics, attorneys, UAV operators, and medics. State Border Service, National Guard, Security Service of Ukraine, all open for recruitment, right? And they say about 17,000 citizens have used this network of recruitment centers. So it's a really interesting kind of contrast. But the 65,000 is only about 20% of Russia's total recruitment abilities. But what about the those who are drafted, right? This is again like enlisting or volunteering to go to Vietnam, right? Many people did it to avoid getting drafted, but many other troops are being drafted, and it's really hard to get Ukraine's numbers of draftees. But I was able to dig around, and I found that this is a fairly authoritative source. This is the head of the Ukrainian Parliament's National Security Committee. In June, he said that Ukrainian military could enlist 20,000 additional troops by the end of the year. So what that means is actually he's estimating that, we'll get out the calculator here, 20,000 total additional troops, and this statement was given in June, or 200,000 additional troops, right, by the end of the year, given in June, so 6 months. So they expect about a recruitment rate of, again, 30,000 new troops, about 20% of which are going to be volunteers. The remainder will be draftees. Now, I actually think that he may have misspoken because that number is really, really high. I suspect it's more like 200,000 troops is the goal for the year, which again would put about 16,000 a month, 16,666. And again, that would track because it means that about a third of that number is actually volunteers, and 2/3 are draftees. So now we have some numbers, right? So we can figure out the actual attrition ratio. Yeah, I know math. Welcome to the real world, guys. So what is the math? In a typical month, right, we can infer that the Russians are bringing in, again, about 30,000 troops, right? And the Ukrainians, let's actually get this right, 16,666 a month, and then the Russian 30,000, meaning that Russia is bringing in about twice the number of troops, a little less, than twice the number of troops, which means that if Ukraine can indeed sustain, right? So Ukraine losing 80,000 over the course of the war to Russia's 200,000, meaning that they actually have a small edge, an edge of about 15% or so over, or is it 15 to 20? Actually, no, that's like 20%. So that means Ukraine appears to have currently a small, about 20% edge over the Russian military. But there's a little more to the story, right? Because human beings are not a factory. You can't just churn them out again and again. And the fact is that we're talking about different methods. The Ukrainians are able to pursue much more aggressive recruitment methods than the Russians, right? Again, the draft notices, the volunteer programs, these are things because Ukraine is fighting for its life. They have overwhelming public support, right? The Ukrainian public is fully supportive of the military, of the draft, and this is hugely in contrast to one of the biggest problems that Russia is facing, and that is keeping the soldiers coming. And this, I think, is the reason why ultimately I believe that if anyone's winning the war of attrition, it's actually Ukraine. And here is why. Because there are signs, there's a lot of signs actually, that Russia is not quite doing as well in the recruitment department as it wants to believe, right? And we're going to take a look here. And before we break that down, I did want to mention, though, if you feel like you have, if you need to just recruit some more energy to get things done, you don't need to stage a giant special military operation. Instead, you might need a little more caffeine. You should check out Strike Gum. Inspired by my time in Afghanistan, when if I wanted energy on a long combat patrol, I had to chug a lukewarm military-issue energy drink. That experience stays with you. I said there's got to be a more portable way to get an energy drink's worth of caffeine into a single place. So I worked with the guys at Liquid Core down in Denver. So we literally made in the USA, veteran-owned, Strike Gum. Strike Gum has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece. Guys, that's as much as a Red Bull in one piece of gum. We have 0 sugar, 100 milligrams alpha GPC. So you definitely want to check us out at strikegum.com. You'd be crazy not to. We're the highest rated energy gum on Amazon for a reason. And that reason is we're delicious. We taste great. We don't taste like a chemical. We're not a dehydrated pill, right? We use natural caffeine. And again, you know that it's made right here in the US of A. So check us out, strikegum.com. Link is in the description. We're also, of course, on Amazon. All right. So Russia has recently hiked its military sign-up bonuses, its one-time contracting payments, by a lot, actually. In fact, Russia, despite being a vastly lower cost of living country, now pays its soldiers 3 or 4 times the prevailing regional wage in annual wage in just sign-up bonuses alone. And they are also recruiting from all over, right? In fact, in Moscow, the one-time payments are as high as $22,000 of sign-up bonuses, in addition to a high monthly salary. That's 2.5 times the average salary in Russia. So for context, guys, the average salary in the United States, about 60 grand. This is the equivalent of offering people pay of about 180 grand a year to join the military, right? In one region, Chelyabinsk, God help me, the one-time payments have been doubled, 2.5 times the average salary in the United States, about 60 grand. This is the equivalent of offering people pay of about 180 grand a year to join the military, right? In one region, Chelyabinsk, God help me, the one-time payments have been doubled, 2.5 times the average salary in the United States, about 60 grand. with a soldier getting $8,000 for signing a military contract, right? And in Yamal-Donetsk, one gets about 14 times Russia's average salary in the region, $12,000 after signing a military contract. Now, why, if Russia's winning the war of attrition, why do they need to raise the salaries and contract bonuses so much, right? In fact, if they could serve for 1 year of military service, they'll receive 60 grand if they sign up from Moscow. If they sign up from Leningrad, 34 grand a year. These are huge paydays by Russian standards, right? And Russia is also running literal 12-hour TV recruitment marathons, calling on viewers to go to enlistment offices in exchange for, quote, unprecedented measures of support for our patriots from the leadership of the Republic. And this is absolutely preposterous, but also it should tell you something, right? They also, of course, will pay you to refer a friend. These are all programs that you don't do if you're winning the war of attrition. Okay? You do not need to ramp up the salaries. You don't need to ramp up the recruitment bonuses. You don't need to pay people for roping their friends into it unless you are desperate for people. I know the US military in 2005 did exactly this. And you know what's funny? What happened in 2008 after the housing crisis and everyone lost their jobs? These programs went away because the US Army wasn't in a recruiting crisis anymore, right? And so there's fears that even though these huge bonuses might be drawing more people, there is a sign that there's a growing shortage of people who actually are willing to serve in the military, right? In fact, when they looked at Yandex, which is the Russian Google, requests or for information about military service, the raising payments boosted search traffic by about 12% before it came back down to normal, right? Normal levels of interest. But searches for contract information decline as soon as the 5th week after the payments are increased, right? And when we look at some of these things, also, there's another sign here. And that is, why would Putin need to boost the size of an army? Why would he need more recruitment resources devoted to the army if he's winning? Why would he need a bigger army if he's winning the war of attrition, right? So all this is not to say that Ukraine's doing great, Russia's doing terrible. But if someone sits there and tells you Russia's winning the war of attrition, these are not the behaviors. These are not the paydays of someone winning the war of attrition. Now, I want to point this out. This is Google Trends. So bear in mind, guys, not Yandex. And Google has been sort of stamped on by Russia and the Russian government. But I searched for CBO contracts. This is Special Military Operation Contract. And you can see that there was no discussion of this at all until about September 2022. And you can see there's been a steady rise in interest as the Russian military has basically worn out all of its professional soldier class and has relied more and more on contract soldiers. And you can see here that I actually think these sort of dips and then troughs are conscripts, because we know that Russian conscripts who complete their military training and are getting ready to discharge back to their home states, that they are often approached by recruiters to say, listen, extend your time in service, sign a contract for the special military operation. And so that's what these localized peaks in interest, I think, might be. But then here's something really interesting. You can see that when Ukraine invaded Kursk, there was a surge in interest, right? This also corresponds to the increase in pay, right? So suddenly somebody's offering you, again, the Russian equivalent to about $200,000 a year to serve in the military. There's a lot of people who Google it to learn more about it. But then what happens? There is an unprecedented decline in interest. In fact, we haven't seen this level of drop-off in interest in any other time. You can see, look at how gradual the interest loss is up into that point, right? There's a few weeks here where it goes from about 46 to about a 36, but this is going from a 100 to a 76, right? So you're losing 25% of your interest in this CBO or in this special military operation contract over the span of just a few weeks, which could indicate that even though there's a lot of people interested in these high-paying roles, that Russia may be beginning to exhaust its population who is even willing to sign up for this, which makes sense, again, given the huge losses that they've incurred. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. Thank you so much to the Colonel Tier members of CombatVetNews.com. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Martin, Gina Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Carias, AL90, and Petra Teruru, as well as all of our Lieutenant Tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.